Good afternoon. We see that a number of people have joined us, and this is Elizabeth Andrus. Hopefully you are seeing a title slide with my photo on it while you've been waiting. We will begin in just about half a minute or so. Thank you. Good afternoon. This is Elizabeth Andrus with the National Center for Home Food Preservation and the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension. Welcome to our first National Center for Home Food Preservation webinar. I would also like to let you know that we do have a staff person with the National Center, Casey Christian, online who will be managing some things in the background for us. But she has handled your registration and broadcast process also, and I know some of you may have seen her name on things. Others of you may have just seen her as the National Center for Home Food Preservation in your correspondence. During this afternoon's broadcast, I will be pausing a couple of times for questions. If you want to speak your question so everyone online can hear you, you will be unmuted at that time and then called on by Casey and then unmuted at that time. You can indicate you have a question by raising your hand from your webinar control panel. And when Casey unmutes you, we will ask you to speak your question. However, you can also submit questions in writing at any time using your question chat box on your control panel from Citrix. You can type your question in the box provided and either hit submit or send, and then I will address as many as possible of those during our question answer times, and that way you can maybe write your question when you're thinking of it and not have to remember or get caught in too many people wanting to speak out loud when we get to the question and answer times. All right. I am probably going to try to cover too much in this webinar time period allotted anyway, so I will go ahead and begin. If you do feel I'm going too fast, you will be receiving a link at the end of this to a recorded version that you can view again, or you can ask me again, write a message at the Q&A time that I can go back over something for you. Our purpose today, as you probably saw the announcement, is to just briefly cover some past and current science activities in home food preservation through USDA and address a little bit of why is it USDA in this business. We'll talk a little bit about recent offerings and current projects of the National Center, and then have a brief review of some current recommendations that USDA food preservation guidelines are based upon and some recommended resources for USDA guidelines. So for those of you that are educators, here it is again in a list of learning objectives. I do hope that you will understand a little of the history of USDA research and publishing activities in home food preservation along with the current consumer practices. And please do understand, I'm not obviously going to cover everything you need to know about canning, drying, or freezing in this webinar, but kind of set you up for some of our basic concepts that are embedded within all of our recommendations. You'll learn hopefully some activities of the National Center and helpful tools to use through the National Center website if you're not familiar with those already. And then I'm hoping you'll be able to apply publicly available resources regarding home food preservation recommendations in your work at home or your work as educators. But we do have a mixed audience online today, and I know a number of you are indeed educators, and in particular extension educators, but I know that we have people on for other purposes also, since this was open to the public. Basically, what we are covering in our work here and what's covered in some current publications from USDA and the land grant system through cooperative extension are these modern methods of food preservation compared to some things that were done in the past. But we basically try to handle canning, freezing, drying, and pickling of foods at home, and then ways to make some spreads, whether it be sugar concentrates or even no sugar added fruit spreads, and a little bit of information on curing and smoking. But there has been nothing for decades current from USDA on curing or smoking, and what we do have there is coming from various land-grant universities throughout the country. What you don't see on here is in any of the current recommendations are just some very specific dry salting methods of food preservation and a few other things that people may be doing. To partly address the question of maybe why USDA, USDA has been in this business since the very beginning of federal agency support. USDA, of course, was the first federal food agency of any kind. And they put out their first definitive body of recommendations for canning at home in the form of a booklet called Canning Vegetables in the Home way back in 1909. And then, of course, there were various variations that were made of those every couple of years, as you often see in government publications. Or if bureau or agency names changed, then it was reprinted with the new agency name on it. But there were, of course, special emphases from the federal government that included USDA and even some war commissions around World War I and World War II times. Some of you may see reference to the Can the Kaiser kind of campaigns, and that was World War I, and victory gardens were really big in the World War II era. I'm going to be coming back and spending more time on canning than anything, so right now I'll give you a little brief history of where USDA has stood in terms of recommendations for a few other methods. But with regard to fermenting, pickling, and salting vegetables, the first federal directions for that actually came out in 1917 from the National Emergency Food Garden Commission. And of course, that was around World War I efforts. In 1920, and for a couple of decades after that, USDA put out versions of its publication that were on fermented pickles or salting and brining, and then eventually a pickle and relish recipes booklet. And in 1964, their first and last major embodiment of all their pickling and relish work done federally was published in Making Pickles and Relishes at Home in 1964. Those have been, of course, incorporated into a lot of subsequent publications, but no other large body of work was redone again after that particular time through USDA's efforts. With regard to freezing recommendations, USDA research switched from canning and pickling and fermenting to freezing in the early 1950s, and that was partly due, of course, to the later invention of the home freezer compared to some other methods that could be used for heating for canning and salting and brining. But now we have a home freezer making its place into homes. And actually between 1964 and 76, I found a figure that said the percent of people freezing food at home more than doubled, and that freezer ownership increased a little more than 50% in those years also. But the freezing research did start back in the early 1950s as freezers were coming into the marketplace. And then it didn't take long, is what I was trying to demonstrate, till the activity in home freezing really picked up. The consumer publications for freezing foods at home from USDA date back to the latest ones really being done in the 1970s and 80s as a series of home garden bulletins. A complete guide to home freezing was drafted by Penn State in the 1980s, but this did never get published for many different reasons of personnel changes, grant withdrawals, and so forth. I'm hoping that we still can bring that to fruition here, but it is a little bit on the back burner compared to some of our currently funded activities right now. So with regard to canning, the majority of today's USDA home canning processes are based on a large body of research that they did either at the federal level or the federal partners in conjunction with state experiment stations from 1944 to 1946 were the publication dates. They of course began a little bit before that. But back after this huge body of work was done, they published home canning of meat in 1945, home canning of fruits and vegetables in 1947, and home canning processes for low acid foods as a technical bulletin in 46. So this was the first reporting of home canning recommendations that actually applied what were the state-of-the-art science at that time, the same methodologies being used for safety of commercially canned foods. And of course, with minor advances and changes in science, these are the methods that are still being used in the commercial canning industry today, as well as for home canning process development. So any of the things you see now in USDA books about home canning of meat or vegetables in particular are the result of this work that was done back in the 40s. There have been a few additions since then, which I'll mention in just a minute, but very few. After USDA kind of stopped their research in home canning and moved on into freezing efforts, a little bit more limited activity was done, but always at state universities, even though it often was with USDA financial support, but it was not done under the USDA labs themselves. In the 1970s, there were a few people working on some studies about low water level or steam canning for acid foods, to substitute for boiling water canning, definitely not for pressure canning. There was one study done at University of Florida on the use of pressure cookers versus canners by Bates and Walsh. And a lot of this had the 70s concerns of either low water level canning in a boiling water canner or using smaller cookers versus larger canners were all related to the energy concerns we were having in the country in the 1970s, and people were trying to look for ways to avoid using so much energy for boiling water in larger containers. None of that work at that time was ever actually finalized and followed up on to come up with new federal guidelines, I will have to say. We're still looking at the issue of steam canning today. Also in the 1970s and 80s, there were quite a few outbreaks of botulism from home processed foods. They weren't even always canned, and a high percentage of those had to do with people trying to make up their own mixes of various kinds of peppers and tomatoes. I think that's when we were probably getting a high interest in some more ethnic type foods and Mexican type salsas and so forth. So USDA labs themselves, as well as at some universities, conducted tests on the issue of can we acidify tomatoes just a little bit, or these mixtures of tomatoes and vegetables enough to be able to use boiling water canning instead of pressure canning. Also back in these times, and for quite a while until very recently, most people were not wanting to use pressure canners that were canning. They really wanted to only trust a boiling water canner. They were afraid of pressure canners. So a lot of work was being done to actually come up with processes with some acidification to allow boiling water canning for some borderline acidity foods. We probably turned the tide in that people are much more willing today to use pressure canners, but that wasn't true at all times, and that's why a lot of effort was expended on coming up with these acidification recommendations. Also in the mid to late 1970s, the University of Minnesota research group did some work on reevaluating some of the USDA low acid canning processes, and it was this work that actually led to USDA eventually withdrawing their canning recommendations for pureed or mashed squashes for one of the things that I know came out of that work. There's been limited work again at University of Massachusetts back in the 70s probably about home canned tomato processes and this issue still of steam canning and atmospheric steam canners for acid foods. There was a little bit of work reported from Virginia Tech in the 1980s about some issues with spoilage in home canned tomatoes using the USDA current process at that time. And their work actually pointed out as a side effect that there could be some issues related to the size of the boiling water canner actually used, and a very small boiling water canner may not deliver the same amount of sterility as a larger boiling water canner. But that issue of boiling water canner size, to my knowledge, has never been followed up with any further research or anybody looking into that issue. But it was published in a peer-reviewed journal at the time. Oregon State University has also done some good work that has been incorporated into the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning that exists today. They did our research for a boiling water process for home canned figs and a boiling water process for Asian pears, and also the pressure canning recommendations we have for smoked fish. Washington State University conducted a series of process development and came out with quite a few home canned salsa directions for boiling water canning, and they have now been incorporated into the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. And then most recently, University of Alaska came up with a process time for canning fish in quart jars, since up until that time we'd only had pint jars available through the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. Someone has asked, why actually do tomatoes need acid when they're pressure canning, and I will be addressing that a little bit later on when I talk about some specific canning recommendations, so I think I will hold off on that right now. USDA's Eastern Regional Research Center up in the Philadelphia area did a group of studies also in the 70s that looked at this issue of acidifying home canned tomatoes and how much is needed in order to cover some of the lower acid tomatoes that were being grown to still allow boiling water canning. They documented just some pH of a whole lot of different tomato varieties at the time, pH issues related to pepper varieties, and then what needed to happen to acidify mixtures of tomatoes and peppers for home canning in boiling water. And maybe I might try to address this issue of acidifying tomatoes right now since it has come up again. The USDA process for home canning of tomatoes is only based on it being below a pH of 4.6 or treated as an acid food. Even when we provide a pressure canning alternative in the USDA book, it is only the equivalent of a boiling water process. In other words, you use a higher temperature in the canner so you can have a shorter time. It was never developed as a process for pressure canning for elimination of concerns about botulism as if it were a low acid tomato. So that's why we say you still have to acidify if you use the pressure canning when both are offered. They're only equivalent processes. There's not a separate pressure canning process for controlling botulism in tomatoes that anyone has researched and properly tested. The current recommendations we do have for home canning of tomatoes, and the people that were responsible for calculating some pressure times to be the equivalent of boiling water times, that was done through USDA funded work at Penn State in the 1980s. They designated Penn State as a center of excellence for a few years to study the origins of all the current USDA recommendations at that time in the 80s, and they were trying to find their own research, in other words, and basis for what was being recommended. The group at Penn State also reevaluated all the tomato processes because USDA was receiving complaints about spoilage issues using the process in existence at the time, and also because they were wanting to incorporate this work of SAPers from the Regional Research Lab about acidifying tomatoes to be safe in boiling water canning. They developed the clear gel-based fruit pie filling recipes for canning that are in the Complete Guide to Home Canning. They provided some national trainings for extension faculty around the country and did write the first edition of the Complete Guide to Home Canning, and I'll be coming back to that later in just a little bit also, or right now. The first one was released at the very end of 1988, quickly revised in May of 1989 because of a few typos in there. The next major revision and updating came out in September of '94, and I will admit I was the one responsible for that because I was working at USDA at the time. And then we revised it again and released the last edition of the Complete Guide to Home Canning in December 2009, and that is the current version. When this was released in the 80s, it has a note still in the cover, but had at the time that this was intended to supersede the 4 previous USDA Home and Garden Bulletins with the titles listed there. The complete guide incorporated canning of fruits and vegetables, canning of meats and poultry, canning pickles and relishes, and canning jellies and jams. And superseded means that it was meant to replace those. So the Complete Guide to Home Canning body of recommendations became what was currently supported. And it's always been the stance that anything before that might be a nice historical publication, but wasn't necessarily in its entirety, or in their entirety, those 4 pubs intended to be used again. Now that doesn't mean everything in there was wrong or no good, because it was a lot incorporated into the complete guide, but USDA only supports the 1 version of publication. This complete guide in the late 80s did incorporate the new research Penn State had done on the tomatoes and tomato products and the pie fillings with clear gel. And a few other changes were introduced in that time, like the USDA recommendation for summer squash canning was removed. A low temperature pasteurization at 180 degrees instead of boiling water was introduced at that time for certain pickle recipes. Jumping ahead, I guess, to the latest version, we did add a section in on salsas and used the Washington State University products as well as a few that we had developed here at the National Center project based at UGA. Other products we developed here were incorporated for the first time that were in the categories of some pickled foods and some different fruit products. We also incorporated research from University of Alaska and Oregon State University and edited the sections on botulism prevention and cleanup at that time in conjunction with USDA review on all of those. All right, I will take a pause here before we move any more into what we've been doing at the National Center for the past decade to see if you have any questions so far, I guess, on this issue of how have we gotten to here so far and what has happened in the past in research. And again, you can type a question in or you can raise your hand. And just so I'm sure we are clear that we're not working on a delay. Casey, could you let me know if you have none? And I'll move on, because we'll have another question time later. Okay. All right, let me just again try to briefly overview what we have been doing under the title of National Center for Home Food Processing and Preservation since the very end of 1999. We really got started in 2000. But we did submit a proposal in a competitive process and became the lead institution on this National Center for at first a 2-year project, and then the next year they had to revise that and we became a new 4-year project. The lead departments here at the University of Georgia are Foods and Nutrition and Food Science and Technology. Initially in this first round we had a collaborator from our Consumer Economics department that helped us with our national surveys of practices. 2 consistent co-PIs I wanted to mention through all the years, even up till now on this project, have been Dr. Judy Harrison in Extension and Foods and Nutrition and Dr. Mark Harrison in Food Science and Technology here at Georgia. I have had some various co-PIs for various segments of this, but they have been consistent partners and supporters for the whole life of this project. Initially, we had a 4-year partner in Alabama A&M University and 2 years with the University of California, Davis. We started with an advisory committee comprised of individuals from various extension organizations at land-grant universities that you see listed here, as well as representatives from what was then Altrista Consumer Products Company, is now Jarden Home Brands, I believe, but basically the manufacturer and distributor of the Ball and Kerr canning supplies. But at that time it was Altrista. And we also had a the home economist from National Presto Industries that deals with their home canning recommendations and their canners. Fast forwarding, then we got a second round of funding, which we eked and stretched out into another 5 years. Again, led here, we had collaborators in this time period from Clemson, University of Illinois and Oregon State University. And this particular project included us developing and teaching an undergraduate course, which we did as a 3-week intensive course here. We conducted some research with refrigerator dill pickle recommendation, and we did some more work on a home canned tomato pepper salsa recommendation. All along through all these 2 projects, we constantly are trying to keep up to date on literature and who else is publishing results and seeing how that might apply to what we're doing. We have done our own original applied research, mostly in product development or process development for canned foods. We did update the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning in various extension consumer publications and web pages, because we did indeed establish the new website, homefoodpreservation.com, or there's also a direct UGA URL. And we produced an instructional video series that is now a Georgia for Sale product of 8 different shows, and I'll showing you those again at the end if you're not familiar with them. And we came up with an original self-study online curriculum that people can work themselves through on home food preservation, and I'll mention that again in just a little bit and tell you more about what's in that. Some of the early research we did was look at microbial profiles of some selected fresh herbs and whole spices that might be used in some home canned products, and that did support the use of what was then a Colorado State University of a mild chlorine wash to reduce microbial loads prior to doing flavored vinegars. We tried to look at the effect of pressure canner size on heat penetration in stewed tomatoes. That did not get published because some more work needs to be done, but I had a graduate student do some comparison of a 6-quart and 8-quart pressure cooker to a 17-quart pressure canner. And one thing we did document out of that was that for all sizes of those cookers and canners, most of the lethality or the sterilizing value of the canning process is acquired during cooling of the canner, so after the process time starts. So we want to make sure that people don't do anything to reduce that cooling period too much. What did not come out of this work yet, and we don't currently have anything going on, but I still would like to get back to it, was really how different would the process times be in a very small cooker versus a larger canner. I also had a student do a project that documented the effect of fill weight on the heat penetration or sterilizing value in a pickled product. That's where we actually came up with what became our original jicama salsa or relish recipe that is now in the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning and on our website. So she first developed this original pickled food product, and even though that may not sound too good for you, I have to put in a plug here that anybody who has ever tasted this absolutely loves it. So I'll just make that note. What we were able to document was if you manage to get a whole lot more food in the jars than we intend a normal fill to be, you will indeed need a longer process time to prevent spoilage. And a typical pint jar like this would hold maybe 380 to 400 grams of solids. We were able to get another 100 or almost another 30% of that into the jar without really overfilling it too greatly. But when we tried to get as tight a pack as we could and still maintain headspace, we found out that it could require more than a double processing time. So all that is saying that it's really important that people pay attention to normal filling guidelines or yields for products and not try to really overstuff their jars. Even in acid foods, they might not get sick, but they could end up with spoilage because the food in the center of the jar isn't going to be getting adequate heat. I also had her try to just pretend she got interrupted when she was filling a jar that was supposed to be a hot fill, and maybe had to answer the phone and talk for 10 minutes and came back, so that the temperature of the food going into the canner had decreased. That particular temperature decrease we got on this product didn't really indicate a change in processing time. However, This was a product that is simmered for 20 minutes or so before you fill it into the jar. So I don't want you to think that the initial fill temperature doesn't matter. I'm going to be talking later about how that really does indeed matter. But those are the things we looked at in this particular study. We also did a year-long or more study with sweetening canned fresh peaches with Splenda. And we, of course, found that people that were used to sugar-flavored fruit still preferred the sugar-flavored fruit. But we did get experience, indeed, that if you don't have sugar in your covering liquid, you will get a little bit more rapid darkening of the fruit, since we know the sugar syrup can help protect the coloring a little bit during storage. But that you could probably come up with an adequately sweetened syrup if you wanted to experiment a little bit, trying to use half the amount of Splenda that would be the equivalent of the sugar. So for example, if you made up a medium syrup, the amounts for a medium sugar syrup, we would recommend you try using half the amount of sugar or Splenda for sugar, simply until you see how well you like it. But the one-to-one substitute of Splenda for sugar was a little bit much for some people to take. So you might want to try a little less than the typical one-to-one ratio, I guess is what I'm trying to say. We had someone develop some reduced fat sausage recommendations, or at least look at that issue. And then we basically spent a lot of time developing some specialty foods in the salsa relishes and sauces category. All of the sauces we did develop were put up on our website as they got approval and finalization, and they are now in the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. We are still working on the wording for one final recommendation in sauces, where we're going to give people the option of making up their own combination of peppers and onions. As long as they use so much tomato and so much lemon juice, then they can mix and match their peppers, onions, or celery. We'll add in there also probably. But if they want to mix and match those, if they want more pepper and less onion, they can do that. And we're just trying to finalize the wording on that one. And I know for some of you on here who reviewed it a long time ago, you probably wonder why it's taking so long, but it's just one of those things that hasn't been on the front burner for a while. These are some of the pickled products we did develop and do have the recommendations available in the complete guide as well as on our website. You may wonder why some of the early things we did, like with the jicama, and here you see chayote and jicama slaw, tomatillos. In our very first grant period, we were specifically asked to develop some products for non-traditional ingredients. And so that's why some of the early work did work with those unusual vegetables or fruits. We also have developed some original mango chutney, hot sauces, canning directions for a lemon curd, and a mango sauce. So I'm going to fast forward real quickly. I think I have one slide here on our current project that just got started in late 2011. This time I have a partner at the University of Wisconsin, or partners, who are going to be looking at some issues again related to atmospheric steam canning research, and look at issues related to, does there need to be a venting period before you start your process time, and what types of foods we might eventually be able to go ahead and recommend these for in the acid food category. And then Clemson University is partnering with us to develop some youth-based food preservation lesson plans and activities that people could use with actually face-to-face youth programs, and teach them some different methods of food preservation. All right, once again I'll pause just a minute to ask if you do have any questions about the National Center specifically. All right, what about the Blue Book? I assume that someone is asking about the Ball Blue Book. I am not in a position where I can actually recommend one particular commercial source over another. I will say that I've never known there to be any issues with what has been recommended in the Ball Blue Book. that they do pay attention to proper process recommendations, and I know more recently they actually have had thermal process specialists working on some new recommendations for them. So I have no reason to tell you it's not a good resource, but I also can't actually endorse any other sources over another. Thank you, Sandy McCurdy, for commenting. I didn't mention one of our newer efforts from the National Center is we did start a blog at the very end of 2012, and Casey Christian, who I mentioned earlier, who's been doing some of the organization for this webinar, is responsible for developing the blog, and we're trying to get at least one, if not two, articles new added to that every week, trying to stay a little current, seasonal, I guess, with some of those topics. But I'm sure that either one of us would like to hear from you if there's something you might like addressed in that blog format. But we hope that you're enjoying it. I've heard feedback from several people that they find that a handy way to just think about what might be a current topic, whether they're using it as is or even using it in some of their educational work or not. I actually can't comment specifically on the date of revision. Someone's asking about the Ball Blue book. I honestly don't know how their dating system works. I know the last one I saw, I could clearly tell it was a 2012 edition, but you can always go to their website, of course, and email their customer service or call them and ask them what their latest version is. Someone else is asking about the cool down time for canning. And to repeat all that, I'm actually going to be coming back to that specifically in the next section about canning concepts. So Janet, please stay tuned and I'll answer that a little bit. Someone has asked, is low water canning and atmospheric steam canning referring to the same things? Not necessarily, no. Back in the 70s, some people were trying to actually see if you could use a boiling water canner as is, but maybe not have the water over the tops of the jars like we currently recommend. For example, maybe only halfway up the sides of the jars. So that's what they were looking at when they were just looking at low water level canning, trying to see if you could, sterilize the food in the jars without covering them in boiling water. And, just FYI, they showed that you really can't do that. That had also been documented way back in the 19-teens and 1920s using some different jars and canners that were available back then, but they came to the same conclusion that it did decrease the sterilization of the process to have the water too low. Atmospheric steam canning actually means you are surrounding your jars in a steam environment and not in water at all. A steam canner is kind of an upside down boiling water canning situation where you put a little bit of water in a shallow bottom tray and bring it to a boil, but your jars sit on a rack above the boiling water and are surrounded by steam, and that's what we mean by atmospheric steam canning versus a low water level in your boiling water canner. We don't have any recommendations for low water level canning, and I've never seen any come out that are truly research-based to endorse that. What had happened with the research in the 70s is they modified the typical situation enough in their data collection that no thermal processing experts do not believe that the data they came up with would reflect what people would actually be doing at home, so they couldn't endorse the recommendations from that study. All right, again, you can keep typing questions in as we go, but I am going to move on because in this next session, or section, I do want to just go over some of the basic foundations, I guess, of what we try to incorporate into our recommendations or that underlie the USDA recommendations. So I'm coming back to thinking about our current methods of preservation that we are trying to keep up with and address, our freezing, canning, and this idea of sweetening and or at least concentrating into spread consistency, and then pickling and fermenting and drying. I do have refrigeration on here as a method of preservation because I want us to remember that technically is preservation, but it's a much shorter term preservation method that really just extends shelf life by cold. It's not anything that really allows long-term preservation. But the methods involved in preserving or extending the shelf life of food with cold, that slows the growth of microorganisms and maybe slows the action of some compounds naturally found in food called enzymes that will lead to decay of food, off flavors eventually, changes in colors and so forth. So my point being here, refrigeration is a way of slowing down these things, but they still will happen. When we're trying to do some longer-term preservation methods, for example by canning, we're actually trying to kill off microorganisms or totally inactivate enzymes so they never will be able to perform their functions in decreasing the quality of food. When we're freezing food, we are really preserving by lowered temperature, so very cold temperature that will make conditions non-conducive or non-favorable for microorganisms to be active. Not all microorganisms like bacteria will be killed off during freezing, but as long as the food remains frozen, they won't be active, and we just then need to worry about how we handle thawed food. Another way that freezing works to preserve food in terms of preventing some reactions from occurring and preventing microorganisms from growing is they don't have water available to them. When the water changes to ice in the frozen state, then this water is no longer available to either chemical reactions that might require it or, most importantly, to microorganisms. So that that's how food stays in a preserved state, basically, when it's frozen. When we're canning, of course, we need to look at more acid foods differently than low acid foods. And again, I'm going to come back to this method or concept of acid in just a few more slides. But when we can our acid category foods like fruits and tomatoes, things that we're doing that help preserve it over time are we're removing some oxygen from inside the container. It is a sealed jar or can, so nothing can re-enter it once it's sealed. We are applying heat in canning. In this case, it's boiling water temperatures. And there's some natural acidity that also inhibits some microorganisms from being able to function in this environment. So there's a combination of factors here that will help preserve food when we're canning fruits and tomatoes. When we're canning vegetables and meats, it's almost the same list, but now we can't really count on their natural acidity levels also inhibiting microorganisms. So what we have going for us in the canning of vegetables and meats would be removal of oxygen, again the sealed jar or can, and then the heat of the processing that is intended to inactivate enzymes and actually kill off microorganisms. Then we come to this category of spreads, which used to be one of the easiest ones to talk about because we were talking about high sugar concentrations and thickening or gelling with pectin that ties up water so it's not available to microorganisms. But now that we can make a lot of spreads without adding sugar specifically or getting as high as sugar concentrations, it's a little bit more complex to talk about. So I am talking about this category here as a possible combination of sweetening and acidifying or somehow thickening but with no added sugar or sweetening taking place. So again, this broad category is of jellies, jams, and spreads, and I'm hoping I have time to come back a little bit to this near the end of my slides. But what's happening in these products is by doing this concentrating or thickening one way or another, we are making water less available to microorganisms, so they're not going to be able to multiply and cause as many problems as they would in foods with a lot more available water. We also, through our recommendations of asking for a short boiling water process before the jar seals, as we're trying to remove oxygen out of the headspace of the jar, because oxygen can cause quality problems if it's trapped inside the jar over time. So we are also looking for a vacuum sealed jar as part of the preservation here, so nothing can re-enter. And also, if it's a fruit-based product, we have the acidity, high acidity, working to help preserve and inhibit microorganisms also. If you happen to have a pepper or onion jelly or jam, peppers and onions are low acid ingredients compared to fruits, but if they happen to be in a recipe that calls for gelling with pectin, you should see some quantity of an acid ingredient added, like a lemon juice, a vinegar, an apple juice, or something like that, because the pectin molecule will not actually gel above a pH of 4.6, and it's actually quite a bit lower than that. So even though they are vegetables, I guess, in these jellies or jams, if they are pectin-based jellies or jams and sweetened like the fruit ones are, then you should see and need a large quantity of acid added also, so that does help in the preservation. In terms of pickling and fermenting, again, we do this quite often with vegetables, even though you can also pickle fruits. But these are preserved by an increased acidity in the product. And with the case of pickling, I'm talking kind of about quick pickling methods here where we're adding vinegar, such as we're adding acid, such as the form of vinegar, lemon juices, lime juices. Or in the case of fermentation, we create an acid environment through microorganisms breaking down some ingredients or carbohydrates in the vegetables and creating an acid environment. And again, acid inhibits the growth of many, many bacteria, and that's very helpful in preservation. USDA recommends a short boiling water process for sealing pickled and fermented foods for room temperature storage versus refrigerator. So that leads also to hopefully driving oxygen out from the headspace of the jar, which helps preserve quality in storage, as well as create a really good quality vacuum seal to keep the food from being recontaminated. When it comes to drying of foods, the basic method of preservation is to get water out of the food so that while it sits in storage, microorganisms cannot be active because they need a minimum amount of water available in order to multiply and grow and cause problems. So if we remove that water from their environment, just like we do in concentrating pectin gels and so forth, then we preserve it through the loss of that available water. All right, since the country is in a canning craze, I wanted to go over some of the basic USDA premises behind their canning recommendations and concepts. We know from some of the survey work we've done, which I'll point out in just a little bit, as well as CDC reports, that we still do get occasional cases of botulism from improper home canning or some other type of food processing where people, for example, may be making something that should be canned and they're not even giving it a canning process. In July of 2012, there was a couple cases of botulism from home canned food served at a barbecue. A review article from CDC was published reporting on 3 cases from home canned vegetables in 2008 and 2009. And I have green beans there. I actually think one of those may have been asparagus or another kind of vegetable. And then there was a review published in 2004 about a summary of botulism in the U.S. for the decade of the 1990s that you might be interested in looking up if you want to know a lot more about that. So I like to refer to canning as preservation by heat and vacuum seal. I know we often just say what's preservation by heat, but this vacuum seal is very important to it being a preserved product also. But basically for canning, food is placed in a jar or a can and then heated to a temperature that destroys microorganisms that we're concerned about. In the process, this heat also inactivates enzymes that will lead to spoilage that otherwise would occur as the food sat around. Remember, enzymes are little naturally found proteins in foods that help promote reactions that lead to breakdown of textures, creation of off flavors, changes in colors, and so forth. So for long-term preservation and storage quality, we want to inactivate these enzymes. With jars in canning, the air is meant to be driven out from the jar under the lid during the heating time in the canner. And that's, as I've said before, our goal is to get oxygen out of the jar to create a much better quality product and a better quality vacuum seal to hold that lid on there during storage. But then the goal would be, as the jar then cools down and everything contracts in the jar, a vacuum is formed to hold that lid airtight on the jar. This again prevents recontamination of the food and also would prevent air from perhaps seeping under the lid to dry the food out in the jar. USDA offers basically 2 methods of canning. One is boiling water temperature canning that can be used for acid foods or foods that are pH 4.6 or below, for those of you that are familiar with the pH concept. And then we have pressure canning options that need to be used for all the low acid foods or those above a pH of 4.6. Again, I come back to this tomato issue. You might see pressure canning options for some tomato products as well as for fruit, some of the fruit products. But anytime you see pressure canning options in the USDA book along with boiling water directions, then that pressure canning is the equivalent of the boiling water process. But it is not intended to be a process for a low acid food. It is just a different time and temperature combination equivalent to it being an acid food. Now, sometimes you'll see tomato products that only offer pressure canning, and that means we know that mixture or the product is above a 4.6, but when you see both boiling water and pressure offered, they're the equivalent process. Generally, a lot of the things we eat as fruits do have a pH of less than 4.6. Some exceptions are melons, watermelons, cantaloupes, mushmelons, some other things in that category. Tomatoes, figs, and Asian pears are very borderline, and you might have natural pH values slightly above 4.6. So that's why in USDA you will see the requirement to add a little bit of citric acid or lemon juice before canning the basic tomato packs and then the figs and Asian pears, and we only offer the boiling water option for those. And then sauerkraut or other properly fermented vegetables like a good fermented dill pickle will fall into this category of acid foods because they're very, very acid when they finish fermenting, even though they start with low acid original ingredients like cabbage or cucumbers, which would naturally be low acid. We also have a group of foods that you can think of as acidified foods, and this is when we might mix acid and low acid foods together, but in order to be treated as a acid food for canning purposes, we have to make sure that in all parts of that mixture, the final pH, we call the equilibrium pH, but that final pH everywhere in there is less than or equal to 4.6. What that means is it's not good enough just for the vinegar brine over, for example, these pickled green beans down in the lower part of your screen. Those are pickled green beans with a garlic clove in the top. It's not good enough for just that brine to be below 4.6. We have to make sure if this is going to be boiling water canned that the green beans themselves end up being acidified and come to a pH of 4.6. So we take time when we study these to make sure how fast that acidifying of the vegetable piece itself happens, and how long and what the process time should be based on that pH. For either mixtures of acid and low acid foods that stay above 4.6 or foods that are naturally above 4.6, we call them low acid foods, and we do require pressure canning for those to make sure that we don't have botulism risks. The reason we use a cutoff of pH 4.6 is indeed because of the threat of botulism poisoning in foods that are sealed up in a moist jar and stored at room temperature when the pH is above 4.6. Yeast, molds, and most bacteria are actually destroyed fairly easily, in reasonable times, maybe even up to an hour, but in reasonable times at boiling temperatures. But Clostridium botulinum is the bacterial name. This exists naturally in our soils and out in the open air in something called a spore form that is very, very hard to kill even with heat. So when we have conditions that these spores like to grow out and produce toxin, we have to make sure that we actually kill off the spores of these bacteria should they be in the jar of food that we're canning. We know that the spores, even if they're there, won't germinate in acid foods below pH 4.6. So that's why we don't have quite as severe processes for acid foods, and we can sterilize the other organisms of concern away in boiling water temperatures. But if we tried to kill spores of Clostridium botulinum in boiling temperatures versus pressure, you're talking hours and hours and hours probably of boiling. So all of the USDA and other research-based recommendations we have for low-acid foods are based on the equivalent usually of 240 degrees inside your canner. And therefore we say a pressure canner must be used for all low-acid foods because you can only get above boiling water temperatures if you're under pressure. So quick synopsis, some of the ways you can prevent botulism is to properly prepare and process foods for the correct time based on research-based process recommendations. Your pressure canner must also be accurate and operated correctly. You know, you have to make sure that you follow the steps needed to get that 240 degrees inside your canner. Make altitude adjustments as needed because temperatures will change depending on your altitude. And then please follow directions from some reputable research-based sources of low-acid canning recommendations. Again, as I said before, I can't really endorse any commercial books, even though there might be some good ones out there, but USDA would be considered a reputable source to us, as well as other cooperative extension state recommendations. And I probably would add to that major manufacturers, you know, pressure canner manufacturers, those at least that are US-based, and I know they're not all, those that are at least US-based do follow USDA recommendations for low-acid foods. But your jar and lid companies, you know, you can look at their recommendations also. And then make sure that you do use up-to-date methods and information. Remember I said that the Complete Guide to Home Canning was intended to replace former USDA publications either. So when somebody calls me, which they sometimes do, and says, well, I'm looking at the 1956 Home Canning of Fruits and Vegetables or Home Canning of Vegetables, you know, I often have to remind them those have changed since then. You know, it might be in that book, but because it's not in the latest book, it means that we're no longer supporting that old recommendation. And usually it's because science has changed or understanding of how those recommendations had come up at the time have now changed. All right, a little bit more on why some of these things matter. When we are coming up with a canning process time recommendation, there's a lot of things that matter to what kind of information you collect. So we say that our process times really are intended for foods that are prepared by the procedure listed with them. If someone calls and asks me, how many minutes do I can my tomatoes, my first question kind of needs to be, how are you preparing your tomatoes? Because we have, I don't know, maybe 6 different types of tomato canning recommendations depending on the procedure. And for example, crushed tomatoes might be, and I'm not looking at it, might be 45 minutes in a boiling water canner, but whole tomatoes might be 35 minutes. But all that relates to the fact that heat transfers throughout that jar while it's in the canner, depending on the way the food is prepared and filled into the jar. We also go to the trouble to document what is the slowest heating spot in the jar or the coldest spot in the jar as it sits in the canner. We then want to collect the heating information in that jar to come up with the process time at that slowest heating spot, because we know if we get that adequately sterilized, then the rest of the jar is adequately sterilized. And that slowest heating spot moves around in the jar depending on the type of food and the way the food is packed into the jar. So you first have to take time to figure out what is that slowest heating spot. And then things like the size of the jar, the size of the food, the shape of the jar, the consistency of the canning liquid, you know, whether you have a thickened liquid over some pieces of food or pure water, all those can have an effect on how heat will actually be distributed throughout the product while it's in the canner. So that kind of means we would like people to follow those preparation directions as well as processing directions, realizing that if you decide to add in some extra sugar or fat or use much bigger food pieces than called for, or add some ingredients that can thicken liquids like flours or starches to something that doesn't call for any of those, then our process time may not be adequate for your food because they could slow down heat penetration. And then remember that the time, well, not remember, I need to tell you, the time it takes to actually heat up and then cool down a pressure canner is counted towards the sterilization of the food. So in order to prevent maybe having to keep food in a pressure canner for an hour and 20 minutes, we might only have to do it for 75 or 90 minutes, because a lot of the time it takes to cool that canner down can also help kill bacteria. So our process times are a combination of the heating that occurs while it's coming up to pressure, while it's processing, and while it's cooling down until we open the pressure canner. So we want to honor the fact that those intervals of heating matter and not do anything, like you wouldn't want to force cool or quickly cool down your canner when we say to please air cool it, because you could then eliminate some of the sterilization that happens during the cooling process. Here's a little bit bigger list, I guess, of how some things that might affect process times one way or another. That would be the acidity of the food, as I mentioned, the preparation style, the thickness or viscosity of the food, how tightly it's packed in the jar, how heat might actually transfer in a particular food. You know, some types of food tissues, an apple slice will heat more quickly than a chunk of meat, for example, just by the nature of its composition. The initial temperature of the food as it's put into the jar or can and then put into the canner can affect what the process time should be, as well as the temperature in the canner and the size and shape of your container. I'm not expecting you to necessarily memorize all this, but you can find this on our website or books if you need it. I'm just trying to make the point a lot has to be taken into consideration when we are trying to come up with new process recommendations, and why I can't necessarily just have you hand me a recipe and tell you what the process time should be. All right. Some of the basic concepts and terms you'll find in current USDA recommendations is we talk about raw packs or hot packs. I know some people sometimes like to talk about a cold pack. I can tell you throughout history that cold pack has sometimes been used by people when they mean raw pack. Sometimes it has been used by people who mean boiling water canning, and sometimes it's used by people who don't can at all but just put food directly in a jar and put a lid on it. So we don't use the term cold pack in our work, but USDA's books and writings do talk about raw pack or hot pack. Raw pack, as you might imagine, is you put unheated but prepared food directly into your jar, and then usually a boiling hot liquid is then poured over the food of one kind or another. And that's in contrast to a hot pack, where food actually is preheated before packing into the jar. And usually it is cooked in the liquid that can then be used to pour over the food in the jar. But we do have a few directions that call for using fresh water and not the cooking water to cover the preheated food. For example, with some beans that you might be, dry beans if you're rehydrating them, or potatoes, we say you preheat the potatoes but then use fresh boiling water when you pour it over the potatoes in the jar, and that's partly because we don't want a lot of excess starch getting in the jar that would have cooked out of the potatoes as you preheated them. Cooking before putting food into jars to do the hot pack actually changes the way it will heat in the canner, so you often will see processing times different for raw packs versus hot packs, and sometimes they are the same, but that has been determined through research calculations. We also talk about head space, and by that we refer to the space in the jar between the inside of the lid and the top of the food or its liquid, but that should be completely empty space, as this illustration from the complete guide shows on this slide. You should always look at the preparation directions for each food, but we do tend to have, generally we have a 1/4 inch of head space for jellied fruit products and jams, a 1/2 inch for boiling water canned foods, such as fruit, tomatoes, and pickles, and anywhere from 1 inch to 1.25 inches for the low acid foods. And that's partly because the food will expand while it's heating, and you will get greater expansion in a pressure canner than you will in boiling water, but we don't want it to expand enough where the food would actually boil out and overflow the jar. So we need a little bit more head space allowed for pressure canned foods. In boiling water canning, we are talking about a temperature around the jars that is whatever your temperature of boiling water is. So it won't be any greater than 212 like at sea level. But as you go up higher in elevation, of course, the temperature at which water boils decreases. So we show increased process times for altitudes over 1,000 feet. And depending on the product, they may increase in 2,000 foot increments or 1,000 feet increments. So you can get that guidance out of the print directions, but that is the reason for it. Some other basics in our boiling water canning processes to make the process time be correct is we do ask that for these process times in USDA that water does cover the filled jars by 1 to 2 inches over the top. What that really, the 1 to 2 is, if you have a longer process time, you might want to start with 2 over. You never want the water to boil away. So if you have something that's a 15-minute process, 10, 15, 20, you probably can get away with about 1 inch over the tops of the jars. But for longer processes, start with a higher water level. And it certainly doesn't hurt to start with 2 inches, even for the shorter processes. Standardized in our recommendations also are when you have hot pack jars, the water in the canner can be at about simmering or 180, but it should not already be boiling when you put the jars in. And for raw pack jars, because of some breakage and heat shock issues, it's recommended that your water be only about 140 degrees, but not quite to simmering level. And then filled and closed jars are placed on a rack in the canner to prevent breakage. And jars get processed for a specific time after the water comes to a boil over them. At the end of the process time in our boiling water canner steps, the heat gets turned off and the lid of the canner can be removed. But then we do have a step that says wait 5 minutes before removing jars to a protected surface to finish air cooling. This 5 minutes in here is a more recent addition to our recommendations, and it was based on being consistent with what the jar and lid manufacturers were saying from some of their research. That 5-minute wait right there is not essential to the safety of the process. It is intended to let the contents settle and boiling stop a little bit inside the jars to minimize the risk of jar contents boiling over when you move them into a colder environment, and to increase the chance of a good vacuum seal. So that is the reason that we have that 5-minute wait in there. In pressure canning processing, we're back now to jars being processed in just enough water that will create a steam environment, but the jars don't have to be covered in water. We do want the steam environment to be the equivalent of 240 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level. So that means, again, at altitudes over 1,000 feet, we need to get the temperature or the pressure higher to increase the temperature up to 240 degrees. So remember, in boiling water canning, for altitude changes, we increase the time as the altitude goes up. For pressure canner, it's been standardized to increasing the temperature, so therefore you increase the pressure at altitudes over 1,000 feet. So in this case, we can just have a few inches of water simmering or hot in the canner. Again, for hot pack jars, it can be about simmering, but it should be about 140 degrees for raw pack jars to prevent breakage. The jars are also on a rack in the canner. There's a few more steps to getting your process time started in pressure canning. You put the lid on the canner with the weight off, or if you have an older canner with something called a petcock, which is a way to open and close an open vent, make sure that's open. We want to start heating this canner with the jars in there and the lid on it without pressure building up at first. So we have to have that opening. If you have a weighted gauge canner, over in the little picture on this slide, I show a canner in the front that is what's called a weighted gauge pressure canner. You don't see a dial on that one. So at first, what you're doing is leaving the weight off that canner so that vent port stays open for the initial heating. In a dial gauge canner, there should be a separate port that does have a weight that goes on it when you want to pressurize it, but you initially leave the weight off that also. Then USDA process times say that you need to exhaust the canner for 10 minutes. What that means is we want to get air that's now inside the canner out of the canner before we pressurize it. Anytime you have air mixed in with steam under pressure, you are lowering the temperature of the steam. You only get 240 degrees in a pure steam environment. So this vent, we call it in the USDA guidelines either venting or exhausting the canner, is meant to get that temperature up to 240 degrees before we start processing. After you have, and we have this illustrated on our website, it's in the Complete Guide to Home Canning and other extension publications also. What you want to do while you still have those vents open on the lid of the canner, turn your heat on high now that you have the lid on there. You want the water to boil. You should eventually be able to visually see a funnel of steam coming out of the top of the canner. Once you can see that steam in a good funnel, you wait 10 minutes before you cover that port. And that research was done at Penn State in the 80s to say that 10 minutes should cover all the canners that we were aware of and that are still in the marketplace. At that time, then you can close the vent or the petcock so pressure will start to build up. But in pressure canning, we still don't start counting our process times until the correct pressure is actually reached. So if it's to be 20 minutes at 11 pounds pressure, you have to get to 11 pounds before you start the 20 minutes. Remember to adjust pressure for altitudes. With pressure canning, at the end of the process time, you can turn off the heat, but you do not take the lid off right away. You have all kinds of pressure variations inside that canner, and if you broke the pressure at 11 or more pounds pressure immediately, you will have the contents of the canner come flying out into the area of lower pressure, and we don't want that to happen. So we let the pressure drop naturally to 0 pounds pressure inside again. Just let it air cool with the jars in there and everything else, and your weights and gauges still closed. After you're pretty sure that it's at 0 pounds pressure, and different canners will have different indicators to help you know that. In some cases there might be locks in the handles. There might be a little plug on the lid that raises up to let you know there's pressure in there, and when it reaches 0 it'll pop back down. Wait 2 minutes after the pressure has gotten 0. We say just to make sure because we don't want you opening it too soon. And then you can remove the weight or open the petcock. But we have added a wait 10 minutes before removing the lid. That used to be 2 minutes in older publications. But again, based on, I guess, sealing success and research from the lid companies, we have added the 10-minute wait like they have to their directions before actually opening the canner. At this time, the temperature in that pressure canner is still going to be about 212 to 214 degrees Fahrenheit. So you need to still open that very carefully. The water in the canner may still be boiling a little. Your jar contents may be boiling. So watch that steam coming out of the canner for safety reasons. Again, none of this is meant to be everything you need to know about canning, but just to review what are important, critical kind of steps to make sure our processes are doing the job they're supposed to do in sterilizing your food. Wanted to say a word quickly about jars and lids. We know that there's several things in the marketplace that have come out or gotten attention after the complete guide was written. USDA recommendations are pretty much based on the traditional two-piece metal lid system. We have research that shows how well they work. That doesn't mean that you might not have success with other lids, but we don't have a body of experience with them to actually endorse them. But what you will see in the USDA guide is this is the best choice. It doesn't say it is the only choice or the only safe choice. It merely says it's the best choice, and that's because that's what we have the most experience with. We are actually here at this center just starting a student study to kind of look and get more experience with the plastic reusable lids in the marketplace and see what we can determine from that. Make sure your canning jars are in good condition, and particularly the sealing surface or really anywhere isn't nicked or scratched. They should be kept warm after being washed clean until you fill them with food to prevent some heat shock. And then you prepare your canning lids in ring bands, rubber rings, whichever lid style you're using by the manufacturer's instructions. This just happens to represent the USDA illustration of what has been recommended so far in the complete guide. Make sure you fill according to recipe recommendations and remove air bubbles, readjust headspace if necessary, wipe jar rims, clean, That's that sealing surface of the jar to make sure you're not going to get food or liquids trapped in there that could interfere with your vacuum seal at the end. And I am running a little short on time, so those are some steps again that can be found in the Complete Guide to Home Canning or photos on our website. Even a good pressure process for low acid foods will not completely inactivate every bacteria that might be in there. It is intended to inactivate anything that could hurt a person. But there are some very, very, very heat-resistant spores of other bacteria that could spoil food quality but not make us sick, that are going to survive. And that's the reason we recommend that you store foods below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Above that, you might start to have some spoilage issues, even though not food safety issues. We do recommend labeling with day and dates and so forth and what's in there. And 50 to 70 degrees is ideal storage conditions. Just note that the higher you get, the more spoilage and deterioration of quality issues you might get. We do say we recommend using within a year for best quality. That also is not intended to indicate you should throw anything out that's over a year old. It says use within a year for best quality. Beyond that, just like with commercially canned foods, you might start to see some quality deterioration. And still be very careful in examining all home canned foods before using them for any signs of spoilage or questions. This is on our website. I just wanted to briefly say we have done a couple of national surveys and basically concluded both in 2001 and 2005 there appears to be a high rate of self-reported risky practices being used to can low-acid foods. For example, we have had people reporting that they're still using boiling water canners. In one of our surveys, it was as high as 30% for canning vegetables, which puts them at high risk for botulism. And we do have people still doing a lot of what we call open kettle canning, or not particularly canning at all. They just put food in a jar and put a lid on it. One of the things we also asked was the source of canning instructions. Family or friends rated high in both national surveys. Of course, we don't know where their family or friends are getting their directions from, so they may actually be from sources we would recommend, but they see themselves as getting directions from family or friends. What was particularly disturbing to us is in both surveys that only about half of the people say they use the directions they're given as is, and almost a third reported that they feel free to adapt them. And not knowing exactly how they're doing that would be a concern. In some cases it may not matter, but in many cases it could be a problem and put them at food safety risk also. So there's still work to be done for those of you who are educators to encourage pressure canners for low acid foods, and of course with established research-based processes. Recognize there's still a large percentage of people using oven canning, like putting jars in a dry oven, or what I call this open kettle, really no canning after filling the jar. So that's something you could try to keep addressing with audiences also, as well as this issue of people adapting recommendations in their own ways. Okay, back to this issue of jellies and jams, and then I'll try to save a few minutes for questions. Just be reminded, you can find this in So Easy to Preserve or on a fact sheet on our website. There's a whole variety of products in this category of things that are kind of preserved by sweetening, and/or sugar, and/or pectin, and it's in some cases there may be some of these products out there where people are just concentrating maybe fruit pulp down to a spreading consistency but not actually gelling it with pectin, and that could present additional spoilage problems over pectin gels because there might be more water activity, more water available to microorganisms. And our process times for true jams and jellies and preserves and conserves are intended for pectin gelled products. So people need to realize that a 5 or 10 minute boiling water process may not work with their own made up, just concentrated fruit mixture. We do have directions for pureed fruit in the USDA Canning Guide that is a 15-minute boiling water process for acid fruits, and people that aren't actually getting pectin gels might be better off using that with their own just fruits, concentrated fruit pulp instead of a gel product. Just again a comment, we do recommend a short boiling water process for even our truly jellied products, and that is intended to get you the best quality in storage by getting that oxygen out of the headspace and getting a good vacuum seal. You have a much higher success rate of getting a vacuum seal with a short boiling water process than simply putting the lid on the jar and letting it sit, or even turning it over for a little bit and letting it then sit upright. You just, this exhaustion of air out of the headspace gives you a better chance at successful sealing. This also short process should inactivate any molds that might have contaminated the jelly or jam as you're filling the jar, and that, you know, can lead to reduction of spoilage issues in storage also. We also recommend a short boiling water canning process for all of our pickled products if you're going to store them at room temperature. And again, the boiling water process for pickled products now only really works if you have a truly acidified vegetable that's below pH 4.6. So for pickling and boiling water canning, we really try to stress that people again follow recommended recipes with canning times, and that you don't alter the proportions or ratios of maybe vegetable to vinegar or acid to low acid ingredients and assume a boiling water process might still work. Now if you work with someone who knows what they're doing, that's another option. But our process time here is also meant to destroy any organisms like molds that might have gotten in the product as you filled the jar, and also to inactivate enzymes in the cucumber or other vegetable tissue that might affect color, flavor, and texture over time in storage. Many pickled products are actually raw packs, where you might just put a raw green bean or raw slices of cucumber in a jar and then pour a hot brine over there. And that may not be enough heat to inactivate enzymes for long storage periods. So the boiling water process would take care of that for you. All right, not that you probably can write these down, but we do have the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning available on the National Center website, and that's fairly easy to remember at homefoodpreservation.com, the second bullet here. We also have incorporated most of these recommendations into our Georgia So Easy to Preserve book. You can check with your own land-grant university cooperative extension. For example, I know Wisconsin, Idaho, and many others, many others, have very good home food preservation publications. And then you might want to look at some, what you might think is reputable manufacturer books, pectin packages, and so forth. But it's just really hard for me to give a blanket recommendation to every manufacturer out there. That's just the current cover of the latest Complete Guide to Home Canning, and we do have the So Easy to Preserve video sets, 2 DVDs with 8 different shows on them that demonstrate how to follow various of our recommendations, and they do cover canning, pickling, freezing, drying, jams and jellies, and so forth. The National Center for Home Food Preservation website, the homepage may change slightly and feature different things at different times, like we just recently featured the webinar on there. But we also, somewhere in the front page, usually have this colorful banner for Preserving Food at Home, a self-study that is still free. People can work their own way through a 4-module course to learn our recommendations for home canning. It's an introduction to food preservation, and then gets into an introduction to home canning, canning acid foods, and canning low acid foods. And again, this USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning is on there. If you actually want this in print, it is being sold by Purdue Extension, and we have a link to their store with this item on our website. We here at University of Georgia do not sell the USDA Complete Guide, but Purdue does. I will let you know that at various times I've seen other publishers try offering this through Amazon.com, and I haven't seen one yet that is actually the complete publication. So if you want it in print, I really recommend that you invest the money and get the version from Purdue. That is the only source USDA has actually authorized at this point in time to handle the sale of the print book for them. We also have how do I menus on the website, where if you just wanted to click on how do I can and then can fruits, and you could find just them fruit by fruit like apples, peaches, whatever, instead of having to look through a book or a whole fact sheet. Some of the challenges, besides me trying to answer some questions here in the next 5 minutes, are really keeping up with the demand for creative new canned products. Again, I've tried to explain a little bit why I can't just always make up a process time for everybody's individual recipe. And it takes quite a bit of research and money, quite frankly, to develop new process times. You may have not remembered this at this point. Our current project that we're funded to do isn't even to still come up with more product development like we did for a number of years. We're doing the youth curriculum, supporting the work at Wisconsin on atmospheric steam canning, and trying to do some more educational outreach and web work in the blog, but we don't actually have anything in our current project that's funding new process development. It's also becoming more of a challenge to keep up just with changing marketplace supplies and equipment and ingredients, and I think we've seen an explosion of changes in new appliances and equipment just in the last 2 to 3 years now that canning has become popular again. For a long time, the industry wasn't investing in a lot of new appliances and tools, but suddenly we're getting a lot of new and different things in the marketplace, and it's really hard to always keep up to date with the latest release there, but we try, and I hope others of you do too. And then we know that people want some more nutritious options in some product formulations and nutrition analyses, and probably that's where I would spend a little bit more of my time if I had it to do that, would be looking at ways to come up with some more less high salt, high sugar kind of options. And then of course keeping everybody up to date is always a challenge also, even though I think the internet has helped there in having more readily available even government information. We do of course have to be wary of a lot of anybody can post their recommendations online also, and they may or may not be following the same research-based standards that USDA and other thermal processing experts would like to support or use. All right, I am going to quickly scan my question log here. I know that we recommend use within 1 year, but what if we have a consumer who wants an exact date for expiration? We cannot give you an exact date for expiration. Theoretically, if the food was processed safely, for example for canning, and stored properly and shows no sign of spoilage, until that vacuum seal is broken, there should be no way that it's further contaminated or becomes unsafe. The one issue with keeping foods too long is you will get quality deterioration. You can get real darkening of colors of many foods. You might get some cloudiness that occurs as starches settle out of the foods. All these extended quality changes over time can start to interfere with our ability to detect spoilage, even though it may not be actual spoilage. It may just be deterioration of the food quality. So it's not a good idea to me to try to use things really old or try to look at 25-year-old food and assume it's safe, because you don't know, if you can't tell. But we just don't have absolute expiration dates to give people, and neither does the commercial industry, quite frankly. But if it was safe, at the time it was originally canned, until that seal's broken, there should be nothing else happening to make it unsafe, if that makes sense. What is the difference between liquid and powdered pectin? Liquid and powdered pectins are manufactured using different kinds of procedures, so the actual form, the chemical form of pectin in a dry form and a liquid form is different, so it will require different amounts of cooking and different amounts of sugar concentration and acidity levels to actually get it to gel. So therefore, no, I would not assume that they can be substituted one for the other in a recipe. Usually they are added at a different period of cooking, and as I say, use different concentrations of sugar. In order to get pectin to gel, the concentration of sugar, the acidity level, and the concentration of pectin, and then the amount of moisture all have to work in concert and in unison and in the right proportion to actually get the pectin molecule to gel. So if you use a different form of chemical structure form of pectin to start with, you're going to have different needs than the other. So we don't recommend that you automatically think you can substitute one for the other. And I say it that way because maybe somebody's going to try it and they're happy with the results, but I would not expect it to work. Some sources suggest using a little bit of butter or margarine to reduce foaming. I have no problem with that recommendation. As a matter of fact, we're starting to use that in some of our lower sugar jams and jellies that tend to get a lot of trapped air to reduce some of the air there also. But there shouldn't be any issues with doing that whatsoever as long as it works. It shouldn't be enough to interfere with the gel at all. Let's see. Let me go back to my log a little. I have a long one to read. Okay, I'm not going to repeat this really long question I got, but it does bring up the issue again, kind of about this reputable source and manufacturer's directions. I do agree with the commenter that occasionally I question even what I see in some manufacturer's booklets. I will say that I do know Presto has current home economics expertise on staff and really supports their home canning efforts really well. And they really want to stay in line with USDA and so forth and so on, or come up with the right thermal processing expert before they might add anything new to their recommendations. So that's, to me a good sign there. It has become increasingly difficult to find on staff, I guess, expertise that really knows and understands home canning with some of the other even major manufacturers. So that might raise a little red flag there with you for some of the others that have now, their companies have reorganized and changed a little bit about how they do things. We used to tell people to boil home canned vegetables before eating. Starting with the USDA Complete Guide in 1988, the statement was made, if you follow these directions, you should not have to do that. Please read the statement on the inside front cover of the 2009 Complete Guide to Home Canning, where we've added a little language to say this is not, this boiling isn't meant to even cover gross under processing situations. But if you have any concern at all, yes, I would boil foods, low acid foods, at least 10 minutes before eating them. But theoretically, it is not necessary if you follow all the steps correctly. But I know that some states continue to recommend this. It's kind of a comfort level thing. How much risk, I guess, are you willing to withstand if you're the one making the recommendation? I think that we are kind of over time. And you might look in your chat box for those that were looking for the blog address. Casey has added that there. So I will try to answer. One last question. Is it correct to say that no clear gel should be used in any tomato products such as salsa? I have access to no data or have ever been aware of any home canning recommendations being developed for Extension or USDA that use clear gel in anything but the pie fillings. So I could not recommend adding that to any of our other tomato products. It's a thickening agent. It would be expected to slow down the heat penetration, and the process times we have would not therefore be adequate. In other words, don't try to make a gravy with clear gel or flour and can it like a beef broth or a chicken broth, because it's going to heat much more slowly, and those times would not be expected to sterilize in the same manner. Uh-oh, I just lost control of my screen. I wanted to quickly say before you go, I hope most of you are still with us, please watch your email. Within an hour you should get an email message about completing an evaluation for this webinar, and it will also contain a link to the recording. I know you can't write this down, but just be aware it will have a real funny looking URL that looks something like what you see on the screen here. But besides helping us in general, this evaluation provides you the opportunity to suggest topics for future webinars from the National Center. And at the end of that evaluation, you'll be directed then to a post-test of knowledge. We were really, really pleased with the high number of you that actually completed the pre-test, and as I indicated, that will help us report to our funders. So please stick with us through a few questions on evaluation, and then follow the link to the post-test that'll enable you to complete that also. And I thank you very much for your time. Hopefully we will also eventually be placing a link on the National Center website to the recording and make it available to others also. If you want to try to give me any quick comments, quick type them in, but other than that, thank you very much, and we need to wrap up because we've exceeded our time. Hope you all have a good